Somewhere in southern Africa stands a wall you could run your hand along for 11 meters and never once feel a drop of mortar, fitted so precisely that for almost a century, the men who found it refused to believe the people living beside it had built it. They wrote reports insisting it was too advanced for the region. They floated theories about lost foreign builders arriving from across the sea. What they refused to write down, for almost 100 years, is the one plain explanation you're about to hear, the one that turned out to be true all along. This is Great Zimbabwe, and the story you're about to hear is really two stories woven together: an African kingdom's rise to real wealth and power, and a deliberate lie about it that outlived that kingdom by 100 years. Start with the walls themselves, because once you see them, you'll understand why anyone ever argued about this place at all. The Great Enclosure, the largest single ancient structure in Africa south of the Sahara, is built entirely from granite blocks split from natural rock, shaped by hand, and stacked without any binding mortar at all. Every block sits in a continuous level course, ring stacked on ring exactly like a dry stone farm wall scaled up to city size, held in place by nothing but its own weight, careful leveling, and a precision of fit you could run a fingernail along without finding a gap. Some sections run over 11 meters high and 5 meters thick at the base. The stone tapers as it climbs, curves as it wraps the hillside, and after roughly 700 years of rain and wind, most of it is still standing exactly where it was raised. Inside the enclosure stands a solid conical tower of the same fitted stone, over 5 meters tall, and here's the part that should bother you: no doorway, no interior chamber, no function anyone has ever fully agreed on to this day. Whatever it meant to the people who built it, it was never meant to be easy. Every block here was split from raw granite outcrops without a single iron chisel, using nothing but controlled heat, water, and enormous patience. Masons selected stone that already wanted to split along its natural grain, then coaxed it apart, block by block, dressing each face flat enough to sit tight against its neighbor with no visible gap at all. Now here is the question that should already be forming in your mind. Who has the organization, the wealth, and the sheer manpower to raise something like this, and keep raising it, generation after generation? The answer starts with something far away from these granite hills entirely, and it's simpler than you'd guess: gold. Between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries, the Shona-speaking kingdom that built this city controlled gold fields scattered across the region, and that gold fed one of the busiest long-distance trade networks anywhere in the medieval world. Contemporary Arab and Portuguese writers alike describe gold arriving from this same interior in such volume that entire coastal economies bent around controlling its flow. Cattle, ivory, and gold moved out toward the coast. In exchange came glass beads, fine cloth, and porcelain, carried inland after crossing the Indian Ocean on dhows sailing all the way from Persia and China. Archaeologists have pulled genuine Chinese celadon shards and Persian glassware directly out of the ground here, hundreds of miles inland from the nearest coastline, so forget whatever isolated village image you might have in your head. This was a working node in a trade route that spanned an entire ocean. Follow the ivory alone, and it leads to one place above all others: Kilwa, an island trading city on the Swahili coast that grew genuinely rich, relaying this exact cargo, Zimbabwean gold and elephant ivory, out across the Indian Ocean to buyers in Arabia, Persia, and India who prized African ivory above every other kind for its size and its density. That wealth built more than walls. It built a functioning state, with a ruling elite, a working capital, and exactly the kind of labor surplus that lets a society spend decades stacking stone for reasons that go well beyond simple shelter. So who were these people, really? Almost certainly the direct ancestors of the modern Shona, whose oral traditions, ceramic styles, and cattle culture connect in an unbroken line straight to the very builders of these walls. At its height, sometime in the 1300s or 1400s, the city may have housed close to 20,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centers anywhere on the African continent at that time. And then, sometime in the 15th century, the city slowly emptied. Overgrazed land, exhausted gold seams, and shifting trade routes are the leading explanations today. The people did not vanish or disappear. They simply dispersed, and went on to found new states elsewhere in the region. For 400 years afterward, the walls stood mostly undisturbed, known to local communities the whole time, woven into their oral histories, never once a secret to the people who actually lived in the surrounding region. Then in 1871, a German geologist and treasure hunter named Karl Mauch arrived, and the second half of this story truly begins. Mauch had come hunting for gold, but what he found first was the wall itself, and what he decided next is the reason you're watching this video today. Standing before that curved granite mass, he concluded almost instantly that African hands could never have built it. So he went looking for a different builder entirely. He noted that a piece of local wood reminded him vaguely of cedar. From that single detail alone, he decided this must be the biblical offer, the source of King Solomon's gold, or a lost colony of the Queen of Sheba. There was no actual evidence for any of it, none you could point to, none anyone ever produced. It was a guess built entirely on the assumption that the people he could plainly see living nearby simply were not capable of this kind of ambitious engineering. But the guess was convenient, and it spread extremely fast. Within a decade, adventurers, treasure hunters, and amateur archaeologists were flooding the site, nearly all of them already convinced they were walking through the ruins of Phoenicians, Egyptians, or some other outside civilization entirely. One of them, a British excavator named Richard Nicklin Hall, was so convinced the site was foreign built that he physically dug out and discarded entire layers of soil containing local artifacts, destroying real evidence in his hunt for a civilization that never actually existed. His own notes described the packed archaeological deposits under his feet as filth, and in places he tore through more than 3 meters of it before he stopped, a loss of evidence no later archaeologist could ever fully undo. He was, at the time, well paid and openly celebrated for it. Why did the theory take hold so completely, and hold on for so long? Because by the late 1800s, this land had a new government, and that government had a very specific reason to prefer any answer other than the true one. Cecil Rhodes and the colonial administration that took his name were actively building a public case that Africans had no history of advanced civilization worth respecting, specifically to justify seizing their land and resources. A city like this one, built by the direct ancestors of the very people being dispossessed, was a direct threat to that convenient story. So the official version became foreign builders. Phoenicians, Sabaeans, anyone at all but the Shona themselves. This was not some fringe opinion held by a few confused explorers out in the field. It became official, deliberate government policy. For decades, the Rhodesian government funded excavations, museum displays, and school textbooks that all repeated the same foreign builder story in lockstep, and quietly discouraged any research that pointed the other way. Then, in 1929, a British archaeologist named Gertrude Caton-Thompson arrived determined to settle the question properly, using real stratigraphy and dating methods instead of assumption and wishful thinking. She dug fresh trenches, examined the pottery, the tools, the entire building sequence layer by careful layer, and compared everything directly against known African material culture from the surrounding region. Her conclusion was blunt and completely unambiguous. Every single piece of evidence pointed to an indigenous African origin, medieval in date, with no trace whatsoever of any foreign architect involved. She cross-referenced layer position, pottery sequence, and every associated find against dated sites elsewhere in the region, and every single method pointed to the same window, roughly the 1100s through the 1400s, built and rebuilt by the same people the whole time. The reaction from the colonial establishment was not gratitude for finally settling the matter. It was fury, the kind that ends careers. Caton-Thompson was mocked in the press, her scientific methods questioned without any real basis, her plain conclusions actively suppressed in official Rhodesian publications for decades afterward. Well into the 1960s, tourist guidebooks sold at the site itself were still legally required to avoid stating plainly that Africans had built it. Archaeologists who spoke the plain, evidence-backed truth in that era risked their jobs, their funding, and in at least one well-documented case, outright deportation from the country itself. One government-employed archaeologist, Peter Garlake, was forced to leave the country in 1970 after publicly stating what the evidence had shown all along. This was African work, built by African hands, for African purposes, from the very first stone. For nearly 100 years, then, the true answer was never really a genuine mystery to the scholars who studied the site closely, whatever the guidebooks told you at the gate. It was a truth that a government worked hard, and at real human cost, to keep firmly buried. So let's go back to that wall now, and look at it again with everything we know. Every fitted block, every tapering course, every single meter of that 11-meter wall was raised by the direct ancestors of the Shona people who still live in this region today. No Phoenicians. No lost colony of Sheba. No outside architect ever once set foot here. Just a wealthy, organized African kingdom, and generations of skilled builders who never bothered to write their own names down. In 1980, when the country finally won independence from colonial rule, its people chose a brand new name for their nation, drawn directly from this very site, Zimbabwe, from a Shona phrase meaning houses of stone. They also chose a symbol. Carved soapstone birds, originally found perched on monoliths within the ruins, sacred objects whose exact original meaning is still genuinely debated, now stand at the center of the national flag and coat of arms. Several of those original bird carvings were looted from the site during the colonial period and scattered into private and museum collections across Europe and South Africa. Some have since been returned home. Others still, to this day, have not. That same carved bird now appears on Zimbabwean banknotes, coins, and postage stamps, stamped onto the ordinary currency that changes hands in markets built 1,000 years after the original carvers ever set down their tools. So the very walls that colonial officials once refused to credit to their true builders are now the exact emblem their descendants proudly chose to represent a free and independent nation. Today, Great Zimbabwe stands as one of the most important archaeological sites on the entire continent, and every serious institution studying it now states plainly what Caton-Thompson had already proven almost a century ago. It was never a mystery you needed some foreign explanation for. It was always, simply, denied. That single word, denied, is really the beating heart of this whole story, so let's slow down and sit with it for just a moment. It was denied first by an explorer who simply could not square what his own eyes were showing him with what he had already firmly decided Africans were capable of. It was denied again by a government that badly needed a founding myth of empty land and absent history to justify what it was actively taking by force. And it was denied a third time by the quiet, very real professional cost imposed on any scholar, of any background at all, who simply dared to say what the evidence had already clearly shown. This same pattern, dismissing genuine African achievement as impossible until scholars are forced to admit otherwise, shows up again and again across the wider history of archaeology on this continent, and honestly, it still quietly echoes in how some popular history reaches you even today. Which is exactly why the plain, well-documented truth here matters every bit as much as the wall itself does. Let's return to those trade routes for just a moment, because they tell you exactly how connected, and how genuinely capable, this kingdom truly was. Gold mined in these very hills traveled overland in long caravans, reached the Swahili coast, and from there crossed an entire ocean, ending up for sale in the markets of Kilwa, Mogadishu, and places further afield still. In return came glass beads from India, fine cloth from Gujarat, porcelain from Ming Dynasty China, luxury goods that only a genuinely wealthy, well-organized state could ever command in this kind of quantity. None of that arrives here by accident. It arrives because a real state existed that could produce a surplus, control its own trade, and negotiate as a true equal with merchants arriving from across an ocean. That is the kingdom these walls actually represent. Not primitive, not mysterious. A confident, wealthy, outward-looking state that simply happened to build in dry stone granite instead of brick or timber. And when that kingdom's own descendants were finally allowed to speak plainly for their own history, the case closed for good. Today, UNESCO formally recognizes Great Zimbabwe as a World Heritage Site, its origin stated plainly on every official record, built by the direct ancestors of the Shona people, beginning around the 11th century. Walk those same curved passageways today, the way visitors do, run your hand along the very same tightly fitted stone that a colonial official once stood before and simply, flatly, refused to believe. The conical tower still stands with its exact purpose still genuinely debated. Ceremonial. Symbolic, possibly a granary marker, possibly something else entirely. Some mysteries here really are honest ones, still genuinely open to this day. But the mystery of who actually built all of it was never really one of them. That answer was always available, sitting right there in plain sight. It was simply, for a very long time, denied. Somewhere in that gap, between what was quietly known and what was ever allowed to be said out loud, an entire century of dismissed African history sits waiting to be properly reckoned with, here and at sites like it right across the continent. Great Zimbabwe was never, ever the wreck of someone else's civilization. It was, from the very first stone to the very last, the deliberate, skilled, generational achievement of the people whose direct descendants still proudly call this land home today. The walls themselves never actually needed any explaining. They needed listening to. And for nearly 100 years, the very people who could have told the plain truth simply were not asked. Now, finally, the record is set straight. The name is Zimbabwe. The builders were Shona. And the stone itself, unlike the story once told about it for so long, never once actually lied. Denied for 100 years. True for 1,000.